perspective, I'm the historian and archaeology consultant for Oakland County Parks. As far as we know, I'm the only historian that works for a county park system. Most historians who work for parks work for national parks, and even very few for state parks. So I'm lucky. I have a great, great job. So what do I do? Well, we have currently 15 parks. Our newest one is right there, Pontiac Oaks. That's the old Hawthorne Park. If you're familiar, right there, just as you move into Waterford, we are redoing that park. We've added a new accessible fishing dock, new playground, new hiking trails, new walking trails. There's a beautiful piece of land. And so we'll be working on that park. We also have down here 3 community parks in Royal Oak Township, Hazel Park, and Oak Park that we are combining with communities on. One of our new ideas is that sometimes communities have a park and they don't have anybody to interpret the nature there. All they just do is have this park and they empty the trash cans. And in this case, we come in with our natural resource team, work on trails. I do the history of the land, and then we run the park together. So that's kind of neat. So my job then are all these pieces of land, beginning with indigenous history up through time. They're spread out over Oakland County. So for most cases, I serve as a historian for the whole county. So I'm called in sometimes in a community that wants to know their oldest building or what farm was there. So it's kind of fun work. Now, so sometimes every one of our parks, even those 3 down there, once began as farms. So I do a lot of history, rural history, tracing old farms and old communities. But sometimes it gets a little odd. In the case you're going to hear about today, I researched a road. All right? It wasn't a farm, wasn't a village, it was a road.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Kinda. It's kinda better.
Is it kind of better?
Okay, let's start with kinda better.
Is that a little bit better?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And because I have spinal stenosis, I look really good standing now. 5 minutes, I'm done. So it'll be more comfortable anyway for me to chat with you, not just, because it's all going to be up here. You don't need to look at me. So why was I researching a road? Well, it was because that particular road was connected in the north to 5 of our parks that happened to be either on that road or very close. And of course, it's Dixie Highway. Now, from Pontiac southward, we had 2 parks, and actually all of 3 of our new community parks along the north or southern part of that road, which we know as Woodward Avenue. So what I learned was that when you're researching land, when you have a significant road nearby, that road becomes part of the history you have to look at. So that's why. Some of you may have heard when I came and talked about the Dixie Highway part of it, and the villages there that have disappeared. Well, now you're going to hear a different story, because the southern route, Woodward Avenue, has a very different history, but I was interested in that too. So today, I'm going to concentrate on Woodward Avenue. Now, one of the problems with Woodward is a lot of people know a lot about it. Most people know the first mile of pavement on the whole planet was between 6 and 7 miles of Woodward Avenue. Most people know the Detroit Zoo is there. Technically in Oakland County, but right there. Most people know there were gobs of drive-ins there. And most people know about the Dream Cruise. So I said, I will find the hidden history. The history that maybe isn't so obvious. So what you're going to get is a slightly unconventional look at the history of Woodward Avenue. And it's 3 different stories. One about a polar bear, and it wasn't at the Detroit Zoo. One about a hypnotist. And one about a ghost river. In my research, I ended up finding those 3 things. And you will find out this afternoon what they had to do with Woodward Avenue. Now, warning. When we think of history, and often the way it's taught in school, It's a nice little even path. Something happens, and the next thing happens, and the next thing happens, and we learn to look at timelines. It's not like that when you do historical research and you want to tell a story like I'm going to tell today. It's much more like that. It twists and turns on itself and gets complicated. And most historians also realize it's a journey down a lot of rabbit holes. You somehow get caught heading down trying to do research, and you just lose your way in this rabbit hole. If you've ever done genealogical research, you know what a rabbit hole is. You suddenly go down here, and suddenly you're way off pathwards. And I'll show you how that happens today. And always the issue, so where do I begin? I, as a historian, and not everybody does that, I always go back to look at indigenous history. What's the Native American story here on that particular road? Is there a story that I have to find? Well, I knew there was one here because I already was familiar with the Saginaw Trail. That was a Native American trail used for 400, 500, 600 years. Native Americans moving along what was essentially a footpath. It went right up here, the beginnings of it. It was connecting the Native American settlements in what would become Detroit with all the settlements of the Saginaw Valley. They were Potawatomi, they were Odawa, they were Ojibwe settlements. And there was a huge amount there in what we call the Saginaw Valley. So I knew enough to know that Woodward Avenue had become something that started as the Saginaw Trail. Now in Oakland County, you can see that it moves from the southeast up to the northwest, crosses our entire county. Over time, I also learned that if you look at this map, if you look at the yellow, that's Woodward Avenue. If you look at the red, that's the Saginaw Trail. Now, what do you see? Woodward Avenue did not follow the Saginaw Trail. We always say, oh, the Saginaw Trail became Woodward Avenue. Only in parts of it. And there's a reason for that. Back to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, when you make a road, you go to point A to point B and you go in a straight line. Native Americans said, no, we take a little different. We take what we call the path of least resistance. If there's something we need to go around, we go around it. And right here, there was a huge swamp, all right? There were cranberry swamp in that area. It was huge. So what did the Woodward, people who built Woodward went right across it, which slowed down traffic on Woodward in wagons. But what did Native Americans do? They split the trail into two and went around the swamp. And that would be a pattern you'll see across Oakland County. That Native American trails were kind of that direction, but you couldn't put a road just on it if you're going to go the point A to point B part. So we see how it deviated right there. Now, I needed to learn some history of this area. So I said, I'm looking for Native American history, and I stumbled upon a cool essay. It was somebody talking about the memories, the reminiscences of Royal Oak, Michigan. It was by someone named Razelman Allen Parker. I had no clue who he was, but I found it interesting. He had given this lecture to the Oakland County Pioneer Society, which of course is still around. Oldest historical society in Michigan, just celebrated our 150th. So he had given the lecture in 1921, and it turned out he was president of the society at that time. And I said, well, he must have come from Royal Oak and known something, and so he was talking about Royal Oak. So I started to read the essay, and sure enough, he went and interviewed people who had long ago come to Royal Oak, including someone he said was Mrs. Ruth Benjamin. And she was in her 90s, and she was already gone in 1921, so I knew she went way back. But he had a chance to interview her, and she talked about when she was growing up, someone who she called a settler on the early trail. She said, he told me a story when I was young. He was an early settler. And he talked about finding the skeletons or 15 or 16 Indians in the area. Likely he discovered a Native American burial ground. And he said it was on the bank of the west branch of the Red Run. All right, I said, well, let me see. If it's a bank, the Red Run must be what? A waterway. Has to be a waterway. So I said, that's proof I need. Because Rassam Parker said this happened along the Saginaw Trail in what today is the Royal Oak area. So that was my first clue. Now, Red Run. I had heard of Red Run. I knew Birch Run. And then I said, wait a minute. Where did the word run come? Is it Red Run River? And actually it's not. Run is the word for a waterway itself. All right? Now, what I learned was that, I can't say too much here, but that different people have different words for a small stream. I'm doing research in West Virginia now. I'm going back in late October. And I learned there, I kept seeing fork. And in West Virginia, that's a small stream. And in some cases, right here, these folks here use the word run. So when they say Red Run, they're talking about a little stream of water. But then those people are in Pennsylvania and New York. How come we're using that phrase? That's because what happened to a bunch of those people after the Erie Canal opened? They came to the Michigan territory. And when you leave, you take your language with you. And when they got here and settled in places, including Oakland County, they called that little waterway Red Run. And Birch Run was the same way, and Rattle Run, and Willow Run. And now it didn't spread over time. As people, new folks came, we kind of just, that word disappeared. So it's got its historical use to it. So now I knew it was the bank of a little tiny stream, and there'd been Native Americans found there. But then he went on. He said, I also learned from talking and looking at people, talking to old records, that they talked about a ditch 4 or 5 feet deep and 250 feet long. It probably was something like that. It was probably a wiggle-woggle ditch. We call them now earthworks, Native American earthworks. And we're not sure. In some cases, we think they were ceremonial. In some cases, we found they were actually a burial mound. We don't know about this one because it's long gone. But that was another piece of evidence. Now, where was it? It was located in Roseland Park Cemetery. When that cemetery went in, people who'd been in the area said, well, at one time, there was an earthwork here. And then he also said, when people got to Royal Oak, they said, people have already been growing stuff here. So they found examples of Indian cornfields. Now, we know that indigenous people beginning 3,000 years ago started planting agricultural crops in Michigan, corn and bean and squash. And many places in Oakland County, early farmers say, I went to plow, I cleared the trees first, went to plow, and somebody was already here before me. I can see the remnants of cornfields. Where were they? They were in Roseland Park Cemetery, right? You're supposed to know the big cemetery right on Woodward. Wow, so I said, I've got good evidence of Native Americans in the area. So that's where my story begins. But then, of course, we know that will change. Native Americans, as white settlers come in, Native Americans are pushed out. Pushed out to the north, pushed out some of them to Kansas, and then Oklahoma. So we'll see a change. And what will happen along that footpath, it'll turn into a rough wagon road. A real rough, what we call a two-track. In 1818, some folks will take that two-track up, and where that track, that little old trail crossed the Clinton River, they'll build a town. It'll be the first non-indigenous inland settlement in Michigan. Well, we know. Now, what will that happen now? people are going to start using that road between Detroit and Pontiac and find a way into Oakland County. We won't become a county till 1820, but we'll see things open. Now, what was the road like? It was a corduroy road. Now, what that meant was it was a log road. Here was the problem with the corduroy road. They just took this log and this log and this log, so the logs weren't the same size. Big log, little log, big log, little log. And this is what happened when you went down the corduroy road. It was a terrible road because they didn't think about we've got to even up the roads, the logs. Later they'll do planks and it'll be much easier. But initially this was a terrible road to go down. And of course there was that swamp. So what happened? You would get on that road with your wagon at sunrise in Detroit, and you would travel towards Royal Oak, and you would get to Royal Oak at sundown. Think about that, like 12 hours to get from Detroit to Royal Oak. If you ever rode that, you can do that in what, 30 minutes unless it's traffic-y. And that was because of the condition of the road and also that two swamps actually there. So it was slow going. So it would be rough for quite a long time. But by 1824, the road had been extended all the way to Pontiac, at least something they called a road. Described as ruts, water-filled holes, and massive amounts of mud. So it wasn't easy traveling. But it didn't matter. People began to settle along that road. They came in mainly first by ox cart, by ox drawing wagon. Every Western movie we ever saw said you had horses pulling them. No, that wasn't true in Michigan. They had oxen, because you needed oxen once you got into Oakland County. We were rocky, we were heavy clay, and your plow being pulled by a horse wasn't very efficient, so you needed oxen. So many people came in by oxen cart. And then all of these little words you see here are the names of people who bought land along the Saginaw Trail. The first you'll see, even though there's names way out east and west, the first people are going to be along the road. Because if you're going to be a farmer, you want to be on a road. You want to be able to move things into your farm and out of your farm. So you'll see the first people will be along the road. Now I'm going to take you back in time and see who were some of those people. What were their stories? I decided to start right here between 11 and 13 Mile. All right? I said I'll just take farms along that little strip. And I started with the Benjamin farm, the John Benjamin farm. And what I learned was they came in 1830, and it was a young man, 20 years old, John Benjamin Jr., and he came with his two brothers and his mother to Michigan. They had left for a reason. Their father had been killed in the War of 1812, and he had become essentially the person to take care of the family. They had heard about cheap land in this new place called Michigan. We were a territory. So he brings the family after the death of the father. Now, where'd they come from? They'd come from New York. Far over Monroe County in New York, the east. Come across, Erie Canal was open. They would have gotten on the Erie Canal, gotten to Buffalo, taken a steamboat across and come into Detroit, and then come up to the land that they purchased. Here's the actual land patent he got from the federal government. It was the federal government who owned the land then. And you'll see John Benjamin of Monroe County, New York. He would have paid $100 for his 80 acres. I don't even want to think what land costs along Woodward right now in that area. But it was selling for about $1.25 an acre at that time. Now you'll see Andrew Jackson's signatures on the land patent. Up until 1830, it would have been the president's signature. Some of them actually were signed by Jackson. But starting in mid-1830, there was so much federal land being sold in places like the Michigan Territory and the state of Ohio. Jackson said, I am tired of signing these things. I'm getting a secretary and he'll write my signature for me. So after 1830, it'll be the president's name but signed by a secretary. Now, land patents are online. If you know the location of your family land and you know they were an original landowner, you can get the land patent online. Well, now what does he do next? He's a young man. He will marry. He'll marry a 16-year-old woman called Ruth Ann Warner. All right? She lived just to the north. Her family were early non-Indigenous settlers. And they'll do what they were all doing, build a log cabin. Build a log cabin, clear your land, use the logs, build a cabin. Now, wait a minute, I said. She would have become Ruth Ann Benjamin. That was Mrs. Benjamin. I had met her before. Rosamond Parker was talking about her story. So I had twisted and turned back to somebody I had already learned about. But by 1845, he did what everybody else was doing. You replaced your log cabin. Log cabins were never meant to be a permanent residence. They were drafty, they were small. You waited until a sawmill was in town where you could build a frame house, and that's what he did in 1845. It lasted a long time, so there's still a photo of it. Would have been Greek Revival. You still have some here out in Independence Township, Greek Revivals. There's a couple near Independence Oaks. It's architecture from 1830 to 1860 in Oakland County. So he'll build his frame house. Now the house was on the eastern side of Woodward, that little triangle. He owned on both sides, but he put his house very close to Woodward and had farmland on the other side. And then he began to make grain cradles. Those were a tool greatly desired. Before grain cradles, they were cutting grain with these big scythes or sickles, one blade. Look what a grain cradle did. It had 3 blades. It was way more efficient. Now, Benjamin didn't invent grain cradles, but he perfected one. And he had kind of a new model. So he was famous in Oakland County and Wayne for the grain cradles he was making. He made them for 40 years. Now, the Berkeley Museum on Woodward, that tiny museum, has a grain cradle they're pretty sure was a John Benjamin cradle. Now, in those days, you didn't put a nameplate on it or anything. Everybody knew it was one of your cradles, but they're pretty sure it was one of his. Royal Oak Museum has another example that's likely a John Benjamin cradle. Now, he died in 1878. I thought, he's an interesting guy. He was selling these grain cradles, had a big farm, cool Greek Revival, but I wasn't finished with him. When I research a person, I'm not finished till I find their grave. It's just something about me. I want to have that closure. Where was he buried, and what's written on his gravestone? So, my goal was to find out where he was buried. I was convinced I would find that. Well, I said I already know. He's got to be, oh wait, forgot. We're going down a rabbit hole. Join me. He's got to be here. Royal Oak Cemetery. Here's what it says right on the sign. The resting place of Royal Oak pioneers. He qualifies. He's all over. Later I'd learn Royal Oak history. He's got to be there. Except when I looked in the Find a Grave site that I use, he wasn't there. I said, I know people get missed. Find a Grave is put in by volunteers, and what if they missed his grave? So I called my friend Don Dreif, who's walked that cemetery 50 times and recorded graves. And I said to him, he said, his grave's not here. I said, where is it? He said, you know, we're not sure. I said, okay, that wasn't very helpful. So I know what I need. Where will it say where he's buried? His obituary, a death notice. So I went to this website, Digital Michigan Newspaper Portal. That has newspapers, including Detroit, Pontiac, Oxford that go back to the 1830s. So there should be, he was famous. He should have an obituary. So I went and began to search for John Benjamin. It's searchable. Sure enough, I found a death notice, and it said, his funeral took place last Sunday at Royal Oak. But it didn't say where he was buried. Okay, I'll find another. Sure enough, another, even longer one. They talked about the last Sunday, a very large procession followed the remains to their last resting place. Which was? It didn't say. Another, he died suddenly of pleurisy and was buried last Sunday, but no burial place. This is like number 3. And yet another one, very long, everything about him, where he was born, grain cradles, the whole thing, but no burial place. I was stuck again. And then, I don't even remember how it happened, but I found his grave in Roseland Park Cemetery. I said, that's that. I've always go look at that big cemetery, big mausoleum. Oh, historic site. It's worth a trip to see their mausoleum. I said, oh, I have found John Benjamin's grave. And then I have my problem. I did my research on Roseland Park, and it said it was started in 1906. And the first burial was 1908. What's our problem here? John Benjamin died in 1878. How do you get buried in a cemetery when you die 30 years before it's a cemetery? I was getting deeper in that rabbit hole. I had to figure, what was going on here? Well, then it got even worse, because next to John Benjamin and marked on his large stone was his son Levi Benjamin. He died in 1866 and is buried there. 20 years before his father. He's in Roseland Park. And yet, Roseland Park records say first burial, 1908. So now I was really stumped. I called the cemetery. They didn't have a clue. We don't know. I said, but how do you people have a burial before you're a cemetery? Well, we've wondered that ourselves, they said. I wasn't giving up. I looked at where Roseland Park Cemetery is. Here it is. Of course, it's on 12 Mile, between 11 and 13. And look what was originally there, the John Benjamin Farm. Ah, I said, what was the early tradition in Oakland County for many farm families? You buried on your farm. I see it over and over and over. And then you might have reinterment, or you might become like Ortonville. Our cemetery was the Phelps family cemetery and the Orton cemetery until 1867. It was a family cemetery. And I figured, you know what, that's what has to have happened. My guess is Roseland Park was first the John Benjamin family, and the family was probably buried in that little corner. And then over time, I found the deed where the Benjamin family sells the land to Roseland Park. But nowhere in the deed does it mention a cemetery. And I have a friend who's been doing research on Roseland Park. She has gone there again. We've been going through records. We're going through newspapers. No one mentions the Benjamin Cemetery. But it has to be the case. It's the only possible reason. Sometime we'll find a mention of that. But right now, that's my best theory. So you see how twisted and turned you get? I was trying to research all of Woodward Avenue, and now I'm finding people buried in a cemetery that doesn't exist, down a big rabbit hole. Well, I backed my way out and said, now what happened to the farm after John's death? Because now I need to trace the land, that nice piece of land. Something happened before it became a cemetery in 1906. What's usually that happens? Farming families pass land down. I needed to find who inherited it. So I went to the 1850 census, found the John Benjamin family, and noticed that he had a daughter and then he had a son. Now you know what's going to happen. The daughter Mary's not going to inherit that farm. It's going to be passed to John Benjamin Jr. Now he was interesting. He was a Civil War soldier. My buddy Worley's in the audience. He's one of my Civil War heroes. Boy, he knows so much about the Civil War. And I found he was a Civil War soldier. Here's what was cool. Here he was, and he was a musician. He was a fife player. Now this isn't his picture, but he would have looked like this in uniform. Civil War units had these small bands attached, little instrumental groups attached to them. He was in an interesting regiment, the 30th Michigan Infantry. They never left Michigan. What were they doing? They were defending the land along the St. Clair River and the Detroit River. Why were they doing that? Well, during the Civil War, there was this idea that the South might try something weird, come up through Canada and attack into Michigan from the north. And so we sent that one little regiment there that protected those waterways. Now John Benjamin, yet we're very close to home. All right, they could probably go home sometime to visit. They never left. The 30th did. So so now I had a Civil War soldier. I also had an 1812 soldier. Remember, he'd been a soldier. Well, now what happened with John? John will marry Martha Campbell in 1868. She will die in 1872. Of course, she's buried in the cemetery that wasn't a cemetery yet. She's buried there also. So she didn't live very long. And then I found another grave there. It was a little girl named Maddie. She was born in 1872 and she died in 1873. She only lived for 1 year. But now I knew, without ever seeing anything else, what happened to Martha. Martha died in childbirth. That's a common pattern you'll see in Oakland County. Women will die in childbirth. Well, now what will he do? Because he has children, he's going to remarry. And he did. He married, to have this beautiful picture of Ella Parker Benjamin. He'll marry essentially the girl next door. She was a farm. Now, what will they do? They'll begin by 1892 adding a second story to their house. They'll add on to it at that time. And you can see we have a nice picture of it here. If you look closely, those porches at the bottom were part of the original Greek revival. And then John Benjamin will die in 1914. It's because I have to look at a lot of death certificates in history, it's the only time I've seen this phrase on a death certificate, instant death, probably a heart attack, because it mentions a heart issue. And sure enough, he'll be buried where his father was buried, in Roseland Park. But at least it's a cemetery now. At least it's a cemetery. Now, by 1930s, the Benjamin family has sold the house. It's been modified again for the third time, and it'll become an antique business for quite some time. And then it will morph one more time when it becomes Aunt Fanny's Chicken on Woodward Avenue. I see some ahs. I know, I remember that place. They were famous for these Southern plantation dinners. It was quite an expensive place. I can remember always wanting to eat there. We ate next door. Anybody remember what was next door? Susie Q was next door, that's right. The Susie Q, because my family couldn't afford, but we did eat next door at the Susie Q, which did have fish and chicken, exactly.
My Sweet 16 was at Aunt Fanny's.
Oh, see, isn't that cool? Very cool. I wish we had been able to keep that. Remember, that was an 1846 structure. But what happened was, by the late 60s, that area was super developed. They wanted the land for an A&P grocery store. And so they'll set up, which is essentially their oldest building at that time. Here is the building. This is 1963 when it's still there. It had a big curved driveway in front. And then by 74, There it is. The A&P was never built, but another store was. And then it will disappear. Well, now I said, I'm going to take another family. Let me just go next door, the Parker family, because now I'll go to the north and then I'll be finished between 12 and 13 Mile. Now, the Parker family got interesting. The Parker family's patriarch, Ezra Parker, came to Michigan in 1835. He came with his son William's family. Remember, he was 89 at the time. 89 in 1830s would be the equivalent of late 90s now. He comes with his family. I knew I had heard the name Ezra Parker before, and I realized why I had. They'd come from New York. I remember Ezra Parker's gravestone I had seen somewhere, and it was because Ezra Parker was a Revolutionary War soldier. We only have 47 of them buried in Oakland County, because by the time people migrate here, these guys are in their 80s and their 90s. But Ezra Parker is one of them. He has 2 gravestones. The DAR has put another stone for him here. Here's on that gravestone. He had quite a Revolutionary War career. He was in the Battle of Lexington, which, you know, starts it off. He was at Bunker Hill and at Saratoga, the turning point. So he was very much involved in the Revolution. He is buried at Royal Oak Cemetery. His grave is there. And then, of course, I had to follow his family down. I found out that William was the son he came to Royal Oak with. Now, he died in 1861. He will pass his land to his son, but it'll take a little bit because he will have all those girls before finally a boy is born. But think about that in those days. All those girls will be bypassed until the son will inherit the land. Now, his name was Asher Bull Parker. I thought, what kind of middle name is Bull? Ah, I learned a lesson I have thus been thankful for. I noticed his mother, maiden name was Bull. It was not an unusual name out east. What was happening was, and it was a good thing, women were afraid of losing their family name, and they often would give their name to their son as a middle name to hold on to that name. So I've learned over time when you have an odd middle name, chances are it was mom's maiden name. So Asher Bull Parker will inherit the Parker farm. I had to find out, well, what about him? What was that family? Here he was. It was A.B. Parker, a farmer like everybody out there. And then down here, his son, who was a lawyer. He will follow eventually and inherit the farm. Well, who was he? R.A. Parker, who was a lawyer. Wait a minute. R.A. Parker, Royal Oak, Rosamond A. Parker. Where have we seen that? That was the guy I had started with. I was back to him again. He was the historian. Well, I had to find more about him. I learned that in 1872 he graduated from the University of Michigan Law School, and he began to specialize in something that around 1900 was becoming a new area for lawyers to specialize in, patent law. And patent law was because of the auto industry. People making automobiles were stealing patents from each other and borrowing things that were copyrighted. And he decided to get interested in that, and he became Henry Ford's patent lawyer. If you know anything about early cars and the Selden issue and the Selden patent, Henry Ford was worried about people stealing the patents he was patenting for car parts. And so he hired Rosamond A. Parker. Here's a great picture. That's Rosamond A. Parker with Henry Ford. So now I had a Henry Ford connection to my research. Well, I said I might as well find out about the rest of the kids. Here was a daughter, Ella. Ella Parker. Wait a minute, I said. She was the one who married John Benjamin. Once again, I was twisting over on myself. And again, you married the girl next door. We had no eHarmony, none of those Match.com. And so, who did you know? You knew the girl next door. And that was the logical thing. And we see these families all over Oakland County intertwining. Out here, the Bailey family and the Rowe family, they intermarried. And you see that pattern. Well, I went down one more because I said, Razelman's going to inherit the farm, but now I'm interested in these kids. So I went and I found William, named for his grandfather. And he was attending school in 1870. Well, that makes sense. But let me see what else he did. Because I said, your father, your brother was very famous. Well, maybe you will be too. 1880, he's here and he's listed as a scientifical lecturer. What's a scientifical lecturer? What were you lecturing about? I'd never heard that term. Well, I had to find out. So then I Googled. When a historian is stuck, they Google. When I'm teaching history research, when you get stuck, you Google. I mean, that's what Google's for. So I Googled William H. Parker in Royal Oak. And that's when I met Lee Blodgett. I said, oh, this is very helpful. I was trying to find what a scientific lecturer is, find out William Parker. Who the heck is Lee Blodgett? Well, the photo that popped up looked like a military uniform. And then down the next rabbit hole. Here was an enlistment record for Lee Blodgett. He was from Royal Oak. He had enlisted in World War I. And I found online next to the enlistment record was a letter he wrote home to his mom, and who was living in Royal Oak at the time. And then I found the letter, and I said, William Parker, the way Google found William Parker connected to Lee Blodgett, so there has to be a connection. Well, here was the letter, and the letter was sent from Archangel, Russia in 1919. What are you doing in Russia after essentially the armistice had been passed? The war was over. What were you doing in your unit? What were you doing in Russia? And where the heck is Archangel, Russia? Well, it turns out that it's almost at the Arctic Circle. It's way far to the north. What were they doing up there? Well, I learned that he was part of the Polar Bear expedition. This was a group of soldiers that, following the end of the war, the Bolshevik Revolution broke out in Russia. And we weren't sure what was going to happen. Remember, Russia was our ally during World War I. So we kept soldiers there and said, maybe just keep an eye on things. And it ends up that this group called the Polar Bear Expedition was there and got involved in fighting Bolshevik revolutionaries for a while, way, way up in this northern part of Russia. It's an interesting group. The Bentley Historical Library online has wonderful information. It's fascinating. Letters they wrote back, diaries they kept, this isolated little unit. And Michigan and Oakland County had several different soldiers. If you go to Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, there's a beautiful monument to the Polar Bear Expedition, which of course gave me my polar bear. That was how the polar bear became a part, because Lee Blodgett was a polar bear. But now wait a minute. What was his connection to William Parker? So I went back, looked at the letter, and at the bottom he said, I had a letter from Uncle Will, William H. Parker, and mighty glad to hear from him. It turned out that Lee Blodgett was William Parker's nephew, which meant Lydia Parker had married into the Blodgett family, and that was the connection. She married in 1897, and where was the Blodgett farm? Right there. Right there in that same spot. Another marrying the girl next door. And that's why, by Googling Parker, I had discovered William Blodgett down that rabbit hole. But I still hadn't solved the problem of a scientific lecturer. Next census will be 1890. No, it won't. It was taken, but it burned in Washington. The 1890 census is essentially gone. Huge gap for family history and for a historian. I had to jump to 1900. And he was still a lecturer. Scientifical now was no longer used, but I couldn't find what scientifical lecturer was. It wouldn't be till I located his gravestone. And on the side it said, 20 years, a hypnotist. That was the fancy name for a hypnotist, scientifical lecturer. It'll only be for about a 10-year period, and then it'll go to lecturer, and then it'll be just hypnotist. But that was what gave me my hypnotist now, besides my polar bear. And then, of course, I had to follow the Parker farm over time. I said, knowing this piece of land, we're at 13 Mile in Woodward, it probably saw significant change. Here is 1940, the Parker farm on the left there, and actually going all the way down, you see 20 Farm Roads, and here is it today. That's the William Beaumont Hospital and Health Center and the mall there. Talk about change over time. See how different that is? If you were with me to see the Dixie Highway change, it's so much different in the South. Radical change for this farmland. Well, now I have one more family because I was so fascinated when I discovered them. I said I haven't done anything between 11 and 12. I probably should move on. I have several miles to go yet. And so I picked the Hamlet Harris family, which turned out to be a really good choice. Here's Hamlet Harris. He's a person of color. Now, family history has two different stories. One says he was Cherokee and African American, and one says he was just Cherokee. We may never know. His wife was African American, probably with Cherokee roots because they're from Georgia. And there were many people of Cherokee and African American heritage in Georgia. Now, the family story says he was free, but he purchased the freedom of his wife, Martha. And they will come to Oakland County. Here's their land patent. This is a very important one because it's 1834. This is the first African American family to have a land patent in Oakland County. Now, John Wilson family is here in 1820, but they don't own their own land. They're renting. They will eventually buy land, but not till the 1840s. So this is the first African American patent. Now, they'll be in the 1840 census, very few African Americans at that time. Now, the 1840 census is interesting. White people on this side and free, quote, colored people on the other side. And there's the Hamlet Harris family all alone in that one column. They'll show up. By 1850, we will stop doing that. Once again, here's the farm. Now, he had a bit of a problem. The Benjamins and the Parkers built their houses right along Woodward. He couldn't do that because so notice how his farm is? It just, the corner of it came out, and that didn't make sense to him. So he built his house here. But then he had to build a long driveway, and because of the nature of the land, it was flattest here. He had to build a long driveway out to Woodward, which he did. He wanted to get to the main road. Now, over time, his driveway will end up being a road. That'll be Catalpa, which of course is still there, Catalpa East and West, which gave me a really cool Oakland County Parks connection because we happen to have Catalpa Oaks just down the road from where his farm was. So when I teach the history of Catalpa Oaks, I always talk about the Harris family. Here's the house he built in 1844. It's been remodeled just like the Benjamin one. What's cool is that it's still there. on Catalpa. It's been moved across the street. I couldn't find out why, but it was moved across the street at one time. It's apartment buildings now. When you drive, you'd never think that that's an 1844 house by one of the first African-American families. He was quite interesting. You know what I had to do. I had to find his grave. He's buried in Royal Oak Township Cemetery, which claim to fame is it was integrated since the beginning. Now, that wasn't common early on in Oakland County. Now, black people and white people were buried in the same cemetery, but the black population is going to be back in a segregated corner for quite a while. This cemetery from 1826 was an integrated cemetery. I also found out him listed on another historical marker. He was one of the founding members of the Royal Oak Baptist Church. He gave $25. Now, it doesn't seem like much, except if you look at what the inflation has done, the equivalent now is $800. That's a lot of money for a farmer. All right, he was a founding member. Something else interesting on the historical plaque said he'd been baptized in the Red Run. Wait a minute, I was back at the Red Run, the little river. They had used that. Now I said, I think I better find out more about the Red Run, because I didn't know where it was. I said, it must be a creek, where is it? Well, I found, this is an 1857 map. Here, right on the map, it says Red Run. And sure enough, it was very close to the Harris Farm and the Benjamin and Parker farms. It existed on the 1857 map. I found a couple photos of it, blurry photos from the late 1800s. And then I found it on a picture showing this subdivision being built. This was when Northwood, or what we call Vincetta subdivision, off Woodward, here's Woodward Avenue. This is when the subdivisions were being built along Woodward. Here's Vincetta Boulevard. And you'll notice it's wiggle-woggly. Now, if we look here, most roads are straight. Vincetta is wiggle-woggly. And that was because the Red Run ran right through it, and they built Vincetta Boulevard along the edges. But then they had a problem. As more and more houses were built, people wanted a way across Red Run. And so they built these cool little bridges. They were very decorative. You can see one for an ad for a Vincetta Park home. Now, if you go today, they're still there. If you go down Vincetta Boulevard, they're still there. They were left behind. But where is Red Run? It's there. It's under in these great big pipes. It was buried, just like the Clinton and Pontiac. What was happening, as more and more houses came in, the Red Run would flood in the spring. And people said, we don't like soggy lawns. Do something with that thing. Fill it in. Do something with it. Well, and further up into Macomb County, where it started, at the Clinton, people were complaining. So essentially, they buried the Red Run. Starting in the 1930s, and they wouldn't finish till the 1960s. It's a massive drainage system, which has another Oakland Parks connection. Because right up here is Red Oaks County Park. And if we look at, here's Red Oaks, where our park is, nice and wiggle-woggly. It's wiggle-woggly because if you look at 1940, the Red Run ran right through the land near the farms, and that became our park. So now, it's gone. If you're golfing at Red Oaks, there's a river underneath you, a waterway. And of course, that's how we named that particular park. So another interesting bit of history, when I'm down at Red Oaks teaching history, I tell people, did you see the river? Did you see the waterway? And they'll tell me no. I said, well, it's there. You just can't see it anymore. Which gave me what? My ghost river, exactly. So you can see a slightly unconventional look at Woodward Avenue, different than you normally hear. But remember, I was trying to do all those miles. What had I accomplished? 2 miles. That was it. All right. And we're talking 4 or 5 years of research. All right. Eventually, I'll head south and I'll do a little more. But it's going to take time. But actually, this is my specialty. We call it microhistory, where we take a little slice of history. It's really effective for a historian who's working on just a single county. We take one little spot, and how much big history can we learn from it? Think what we learned. We learned about indigenous history, that burial grounds were in Oakland County. People planted corn and it was still here. We learned about the Saginaw Trail. We learned about early non-indigenous settlement and how they came out along that simple road. And we learned about who they were. We learned about where they came from. 85% of the first non-indigenous settlers will come from New York. Erie Canal opens, down the Erie Canal, and they're here in the Michigan Territory. We learned about some of the first African-American residents of Oakland County. We learned about the idea of how families get connected. People marry each other, and the interconnection of families. We learned about the Revolutionary War soldiers who came here when they were old and are buried here. But wait a minute, that wasn't the only war we learned about. 1812, we had a connection. Civil War, and World War I. 4 different conflicts in 2 miles of land. And we learned about massive change of land over time. We learned that farms in our area get developed, and that's part of the story. And finally, we learn about sometimes when something's in the way, human beings get rid of it. All right? We know that in places in the South where we're cutting off mountaintops in order to make mines, and we bury rivers when they're in our way. We call it planetary engineering, big time change. And we also learned that it's a twisted turn. It's not like the timeline you looked in your textbook in high school. And be prepared to head down a rabbit hole. All right. So, slightly unconventional. We have time for questions or comments. Thank you.